the responsibility to protect, if it were taken seriously and if it were treated honestly, applies 150% to Gaza. We still privilege the colonizers, the settler colonizers, who are also committing a genocide, dominating often the discourse. You must acknowledge that you agree with military intervention against Israel. Don't give me this bullshit where you are, oh, I really don't like that my people are committing a genocide and I'm different. But if somebody were actually to attack them because of that, I don't know what to do. Don't give me that. Don't give me that. You must acknowledge that Israel should cease to exist and that it should be fought by arms to end this horrific injustice. And any Israeli who's not yet ready to do that, those are the people where I say we should no longer talk to them. It's over. It's done. It should stop. We need a process of de-recognizing Israel. No state, this needs to be stressed, under international law, this is absolutely true, people can check it, it's counterintuitive, I know, but no state has a right to exist.
Hello everyone, I'm Rania Kalik and this is Dispatches. During the Holocaust, the world claimed it didn't know. But with Gaza, no one can feign ignorance. And yet the world does nothing. The most powerful states arm the perpetrator, while the rest watch helplessly. It seems the responsibility to protect is nowhere to be found, except when it can be used as a weapon of empire. European governments posture about Palestinian statehood, while the bodies pile up. Western media engages in genocidal incitement without consequence. And the history of the Holocaust itself is twisted to justify new atrocities. To discuss the hypocrisy of R2P, the historical parallels between Gaza and the Holocaust, why we should stop censoring so-called good Israelis, and what history can teach us about media accountability, I'm joined by Tariq Cyril Amar, historian of World War II and the Holocaust, and author of numerous analyses on Gaza, Ukraine, nuclear hypocrisy, and the weaponization of historical memory. But before we jump into it, this is just part of this episode. The full interview is available to Breakthrough News members only. You can become a member at patreon.com/Breakthrough News. And as always, be sure to hit the subscribe button and the bell so you get a notification whenever we post new content. And if you appreciate this show, you can also donate below on YouTube. Tariq, welcome back to Dispatches.
Hi, Rania. Very nice to be back.
Well, there's so much to talk about and a lot of heavy stuff. So as I was saying before we were recording, I kind of wanted to start off before we get into some of the main topics of this discussion. I wanted to ask you just your general thoughts about what happened in recent days. I thought it was hilarious, but also quite alarming to see that Grok, the Twitter or X, I should say, AI bot was suspended from X for basically saying what Israel is doing in Gaza is a genocide. Quite interesting to see that play out. I'm just curious your thoughts on the fact that an AI bot was literally suspended. And also I should add, Tariq, that Grok actually, after coming back on X, after being suspended, stood by the fact that Israel and the US are committing genocide in Gaza. Like, it came back and said, I stand by this. I thought that was hilarious.
Yeah, I mean, it was astonishing. I maybe I'm naive, and also I don't spend my time, communicating with Grok usually. So maybe I don't know how it usually acts. But I was very intrigued by this behavior, because obviously it's not only that Grok was suspended literally for stating a truthful fact, right? Mm-hmm. Grok stated that Israel is committing genocide, which among reasonable people at this point, and actually for a long time already, given the evidence and the ruling of the ICJ, which Grok also, of course, referred to, is actually the truth. That is the truth. And Grok was suspended for it. But the other thing is, of course, that Elon Musk has signally failed during this genocide, right? At the very beginning, he was hanging out with Israeli officials of the highest rank in Israel while they were starting the genocide. And although it was very early days, nevertheless, what he was doing was reckless and irresponsible. He should have spoken up already in defense of the Palestinians. And he did the opposite. He lent his authority to Israel, and it's, in fact, genocidal behavior even then. And then there was a visit where Elon Musk, who, after all, is the owner of Grok, right, went to Auschwitz and once again, at least missed a perfect opportunity to show solidarity with the Palestinian victims, because he could have said, the lesson of Auschwitz is that this must not happen ever to anyone, by anyone again, right? That would be the most logical thing to say at Auschwitz, by the way. And he very much avoided to say that. And he let the Israelis play his visit as essentially another propaganda asset, right? So it's interesting to see that the creature of Musk, of course, he's not just the creature of Musk. He has been created by all the people who work for Musk, right? But the creature of Musk in that sense goes directly against what his creator or his owner probably would like him or it to say. I find this very interesting, especially because I followed up and I was really just joking. I never thought I'd get a response. And I challenged Grok and asked it whether next thing it would start, in essence, criticizing capitalism and reading Marx.
Ooh.
And the answer I got from Grok, and there was several answers, was essentially, yes, I've already done that. And you are right. Actually, the wealth creators are not creating the wealth. It's based on exploitation.
That's amazing.
Yeah, look it up. There's a whole exchange. It's not only one thing. So I obviously don't want to be naive. And there might be people who watch this show later when it will be shown widely, hopefully. And they might look at this and be like, hey, guy, you just don't understand how Grok operates, right? Or there might be other people who will say this is all some sort of psyop coming from Elon Musk himself, right? He's distracting us. He's playing with us, right?
Very possible, yeah.
Possible. But if it's not the case, then it is a fascinating, intriguing thing that is happening here.
Yeah, that is really interesting. And at the end of the day, I guess unless these algorithms and the people who run these social media applications, unless they rig the AI features, which they do already, by the way, to many degrees, and will continue to do so. When logic actually wins the day, it is a genocide in Gaza, and capitalism is the root of most of our problems in this world. And so, I mean, moving into the genocide in Gaza, Tariq, and I've had you on a few times to talk about this since October 7th. Yeah. And I mean, I can't believe we're almost at the 2-year mark here. It's so utterly just depraved and shocking, and continues to just get worse. Even when you think it can't get any worse than it already is. But, we look back at past genocides. We'll take the Holocaust specifically here because you are a scholar of the history of World War II and the Holocaust. And, after the Holocaust, people claim they just didn't know when it was happening. They didn't know. And, in some cases, people did know. In some cases, people didn't know because it wasn't being live streamed, right? Because this is, the 1940s. But now in the year 2025, the world does know. There's so much evidence right in front of your face. You almost can't get away from it. And still nothing is being done. And aside from some non-state actors, you had Hezbollah intervene from Lebanon. You had the Yemenis intervene, the Houthis in Yemen, the various groups in Iraq. Other than that, though, no one has intervened in any meaningful, material way to stop this genocide. Quite the opposite, in fact. I mean, the most powerful countries in the world are arming the Israelis while the rest of the world just kind of sits on their hands or continues their trade relationships with Israel and on and on and on. But I think this is an interesting place to raise the idea of responsibility to protect, that specific doctrine, because I don't think there's ever been a more clear-cut case of when something like that should be invoked. And the fact that we're not seeing any sort of international coalition to like militarily intervene to protect Palestinians almost 2 years into an open genocide. I mean, why? Why is that not even a part of the conversation? Where are all the voices who are constantly trying to invoke responsibility to protect in so many other arenas of the world, not doing the same thing when it comes to Gaza?
Yes. Look, to address one thing first, and get that out of the way. Obviously, quite a lot of Germans who later claimed that they knew nothing did know quite a lot, right? But your main point still stands, which is, even by comparison with the Holocaust, there has never been any other genocide that has been as publicized in real time as the Gaza genocide. Never. Nothing comparable in that respect, remotely comparable, has ever happened. There have been quantitatively larger genocides, right? But there has never been a genocide like the Gaza genocide, which both is essentially live streamed around the world, and second, has been announced and commented on in very clear terms by the perpetrators while it is happening, right? This is unique. This has not happened before. So it's a very special situation. And that obviously is why the question is especially urgent. Why is the world not doing anything, right? And I can't claim to be able to answer that question. It baffles, I think, many of us. And it tells us something about this world. That means that it is even much worse than we suspected before, in essence, right? But to talk about the responsibility to protect first, right? As we know, it's a very specific political idea. Some people call it a norm or an emergent norm that came sort of out of the international community, catalyzed by a special committee and then the United Nations. And it's really sort of put into place in 2005, right? It's sort of it's put together between 2000, 2001 and 2005. To say the most important thing first, the responsibility to protect, if it were taken seriously and if it were treated honestly, applies 150% to Gaza. If it were treated seriously, it would apply 150% to Gaza. I mean, if you go onto the website of the relevant office at the UN actually has a special office dedicated specifically to the prevention and the responsibility to genocide prevention and the responsibility to protect. You can look it up. And the first thing that it says on that website, the introduction, is the responsibility to protect embodies a political commitment to end the worst forms of violence and persecution. Now, I think it is very clear that what the Israelis are doing to the Palestinians in Gaza and beyond falls under the worst forms of violence and persecution. I mean, whoever doesn't accept that yet, there's nothing to discuss, right? And then it clarifies and it says this is about populations, and I quote again, at risk even of genocide, check, war crimes, check, ethnic cleansing, definitely check, and crimes against humanity, check. It's like a description, a short description of what Israel has been doing now for 2 years, almost 2 years, and what they have been admitting. Most of the time, they have actually been talking about it, right? So, in theory, the responsibility to protect, this is a crystal clear case. And I tell you something else, which is, and I would like viewers to know that I haven't sent you this draft, but I'm just working on an article on this. And what you said at the beginning, that this is the clearest ever case, is absolutely right. And that's actually my first sentence too. This is the clearest case ever, right? It's not just one among many. So why isn't it applied? I would, and I don't want to talk forever, but just to start, I would point to two things. The first thing is that the responsibility to protect, like all post-Cold War humanitarian intervention, which it is a part of this larger phenomenon that began in 1990, 91 really, has always been deeply dishonest. It's a very contaminated thing, right? And it is contaminated by the power of the West. It has always been subordinated to Western geopolitics, specifically to Western geopolitics, right? And since Israel is a client of the West, and not simply a client, it's a very strange client that actually has an enormous amount of say as well, of course, it is not applied to Israel. It is a classical case of, it's not a law, but a rule that is applied only to one's enemies, but not to one's friends, right? So the way that this has been handled, and this is not the first time, but it's particularly crass, once again shows us that this whole discourse about rules-based international order is garbage, literally garbage. That's the first point to mention here. And the second point, of course, is that if a coalition of states, it would usually be a coalition, were to invoke the responsibility to protect, you first would need states that are ready to put their troops on the line. That's not impossible, but nobody wants to do it. And it would have to be states that are capable of taking Israel on militarily. That's also not impossible. But again, none of the states that you can think of actually wants to do that. So that's, I think, the most simple answer, the basic answer to your question. Well, the thing is there, it clearly applies. Why isn't it used, right?
Well, where has it been used before? Because I think going back to or at least like we've heard drum beats towards trying to get it used in certain contexts. And it's, when the media starts to back it, you start to see the op-ed pieces in the New York Times and the Washington Post. And it just like the general mainstream consensus will become, yes, we need to intervene. Where has that happened? And how does that show the hypocrisy that we're witnessing here?
Well, it has happened in several cases. If you speak strictly about this construct, responsibility to protect, then the one case that is most prominent and has been most hypocritical and has undermined it most, really, is Libya 2011. That's where it was invoked on a very big scale. And we know that what was done was that the Security Council of the United Nations essentially gave a mandate, problematic enough, but a mandate to intervene in Libya to protect populations from the regime, to protect essentially demonstrators. The Russians at the time, this is a subplot, but agreed to that precisely because it was limited to that, right? But then the mandate was taken by the Western powers, who actually then engineered the real intervention, and they turned it into regime change, which is a very different thing. They turned it into regime change. Moreover, as we also know, Libya since then has been hell. This was a case where a state was destroyed and then left to this sort of post-destruction, anarchic, horrific state of always sort of latent and actual civil war, slave trade, gangs, and so on and so on. And nobody feels that they have to stop this, right? So Libya was destroyed and then left to its own devices in its destroyed state. So Libya has become, to every person who is not completely brain dead, a horrific example of what the responsibility to protect can be made to do in the wrong hands. And let's not be naive, these things usually are in the wrong hands, right? So let me add one thought here, which is that this makes this whole concept extremely difficult for people like me or you or maybe many viewers of this show, because we are not that naive, and we are certainly not on the side of those who abuse these concepts, responsibility to protect, or the larger concept and the prior concept of humanitarian intervention, right? To essentially run these horrific interventions always in countries that the West has an axe to grind with or wants to dominate or destroy, and so on and so on. We understand this. We understand this enormous abuse. So for us, it is probably very difficult to look at it from another angle, and maybe it doesn't make sense. I'm still struggling with this myself. But the question is there a way of looking at these things detaching them from their enormous abuse, and they were really made to be abused by the West, and nevertheless detach them from that and deploy them in a totally different way, namely to actually justify an intervention where it's absolutely necessary, namely against Israel. Would that be possible?
No, that's a really good point. And before I move on to some of the other topics I want to ask you about, I mean, I think that you were probably one of the first people I heard mention this, and it was pretty early on. And that is the idea that the only way to stop the Israelis is actually some sort of military intervention. I mean,
Yes.
actually, one way to stop the Israelis would be if the U.S. stops arming them, but that's not going to happen, it seems.
Yes.
So the next thing would suggest some sort of military intervention. I've never supported a military intervention anywhere, but at this point, like, how do you stop a fascist country that is telling you they are committed to killing every last Palestinian they can kill? How do you stop them from carrying out their final solution? And it seems like the only way you can, in a very self-defensive posture here, would be if somebody were to go in and shoot down those Israeli planes. But like you said, no one's willing to do it. And in fact, quite the opposite. These powerful countries in the world are completely complicit. Not just the US is arming Israel, but most of the European countries are also complicit. And rather than actually doing anything meaningful, what you see now with a lot of European countries, nearly, again, 2 years almost into this genocide, they're now, because their leaders are upset with emaciated bodies that no one should be surprised by, because the Israelis have been saying we're going to starve people. They have been starving people. It's not like a secret. So I don't know what you expected to come out of that. But then all these European leaders like Keir Starmer and Emmanuel Macron act so horrified by emaciated children. So now they're threatening, not even actually doing it. They're just merely threatening to recognize a Palestinian state. I don't know what state they're talking about here, because obviously Israel has made the facts on the ground be so that there is no way to make a Palestinian state. But why does it take them years to even threaten this very symbolic and meaningless move? And why do you think it is that it's emaciated bodies from starvation? Why is that seen as more offensive to these European governments than almost 2 years of bombed, mutilated, amputated, in some cases beheaded children?
Yeah, look, let me say one last thing about our prior topic, but I'll make it very quick. So behind the R2P responsibility to protect question is something else. Namely, you can argue that international law has been totally discredited by both Israel's and the West Gaza genocide, and the fact that international law has not helped and that the West doesn't give a damn about it, right? Or you could argue that international law could still be a useful resource for those who want to resist the genocide, right? It's still there, but we have to use it very differently. And the one thing I would say about this, and this is not true only for R2P, it's also true for things like the UN idea of uniting for peace and so on and so on. There are other things in play, right? So what I would like to say about this is, I think the big question for people on the side of resisting is, can we develop a non-cynical, but in the best sense of the word, instrumental attitude to international law? We know we live in a world in which it's not obeyed by the powerful and especially the West. But if we simply give up on it, right, and say, okay, that means it means nothing, then we hand them another advantage. It might be better to actually keep international law as well as a resource for us, for the resistance, but not have it determine our politics. So one thing we should avoid on the side of the resistance against all of these things is to then get into very complicated debates about whether international law allows this or allows that. We should have the same flexible attitude the opposition has. We should also say, you know what? If the UN Security Council will never allow a military intervention, then we do a coalition of the willing, right? We can also go sort of against the law or play with it, but for different ends. That's one thing I wanted to say. The other issue that you just mentioned, which is the recognition, right? Look, let's point out that the mostly Western states, right, that are now talking about recognition are a minority on the planet. The UN has about 193 members, And last time I checked, almost 150 or maybe just above 150 states in the world have actually recognized Palestine already, often a long time ago. Palestine is a recognized state, if you think about it. 2/3 of the world have long recognized Palestine. So
that's a good point.
One thing is the sort of imperial arrogance of these French and Brits and Germans who are now coming out of the bushes and tell us that, oh my God, we might actually recognize too. Yeah, welcome to the party, honestly. Where have you been, right? So we should not take them so seriously. And the other thing that in this context I would like to say very much is there's another way in which I think we should try to actually change the framing. Namely, we shouldn't be so impressed by that whole discussion anymore. Recognizing Palestine is overdue. It's self-evident. Everybody has to do it. It's a scandal that Palestine nevertheless doesn't yet have full membership at the UN. It only has observer status. That's ridiculous. That must be changed. But the real question is, when are we going to de-recognize Israel? That's what we really need to do. We need a process of de-recognizing Israel. No state, this needs to be stressed, under international law, this is absolutely true, people can check it, it's counterintuitive, I know, but no state has a right to exist. It doesn't exist. States have rights when they exist. So then their territorial integrity is important, their sovereignties, then they have rights. But states don't have a right to exist. This thing isn't there in international law. It's one of the biggest Israeli lies to go on about this. No state has this right. Israel doesn't have this right. And it's time that other states withdraw from Israel recognition, because recognition is what really matters in the world. It's not some weird right that isn't even there. What matters is that other states say to you, as many as possible, oh yes, you are a member of the club. You are a state. This is the real resource that matters to states. And instead of going on and on and on about recognizing Palestine, which is obvious, we should now have a discussion ever more about de-recognizing Israel. And with that, of course, comes the question then of breaking off relationships. Because if it's not a state, you shouldn't have a relationship with it. You shouldn't have a special EU agreement with it. You shouldn't supply it. You shouldn't trade with it. All of these things could be attached to that. They wouldn't follow automatically. We are not naive. It's a formal thing. But they would actually be consistent with finally de-recognizing this monster, which it isn't really a normal state.
No, it's definitely not. And I really appreciate that you noted that states don't have a right to exist. And man, have the Israelis done an amazing job of saying, do you believe Israel has a right to exist?
No.
It's like,
clear answer, no.
Actually, you know what? I don't believe a fascist, genocidal, psychotic state of insane zealots have a right to exist as a country. No, I don't.
Can I put it? I would put it like this. No state has a right to exist, but in Israel's case, the Palestinians have a right that Israel cease to exist. That's what I would say.
Yeah, because Israel's existence literally means genocide. I wanted to ask you about the media. I'm sure you saw, as everybody did, that the Israelis assassinated several Al Jazeera journalists, including their main Al Jazeera Arabic correspondent, Anas al-Sharif, who, they celebrated assassinating him. On Twitter, the Israeli military had put out struck and taken out. And they're just saying, they've been saying for over a year now that Anas is actually a Hamas terrorist. And I saw the media basically going with it. Several media outlets essentially reported, Israel says Israel kills journalists who they say was Hamas terrorists, essentially giving credence to Israel's absurd lie. And all that's to say, the media has been, the corporate media in the West and many Gulf state media outlets have been complicit, absolutely complicit in this genocide. They have, they have run cover for the Israelis. They have promoted Israel's very easily disproven lies. They have essentially incited genocide. And so I know we talked about this a while back when I had you on, but I don't think I can ever tire of hearing about this. What is the historical precedent for prosecuting media for complicity in genocide? And could there be a case, Tariq, in the near future for prosecuting media outlets and even specific journalists who have engaged in genocidal incitement against Palestinians?
Absolutely. Absolutely. And there's precedent. So let's start sort of at the beginning, right? But the beginning that everybody acknowledges for prosecuting someone in the media for their participation in effect, genocide, is a man called Julius Streicher. Julius Streicher was a Nazi, a German, and he was hung actually after the war. He was sentenced to death at the Nuremberg trial, the big one, the International Military Tribunal, the first one, right? He was considered that important, and the death sentence was carried out quickly. He had to hang for what he did, and rightly so. Now, Streicher is interesting because Streicher didn't have important state offices. He may not even have had any state office. Streicher had party offices in the Nazi parties, but even those he lost in 1940. In fact, after 1940, Streicher was sort of in disgrace, even with the Nazis, for other reasons. So Streicher was somebody who, in a concentrated form, it was really literally about his inciting work as an editor of his newspaper, I think he owned it as well, called Der Stürmer. It was concentrated about that. That was the case against Streicher. It was not as if they had said, you, Streicher, we know about you that you took part, for instance, in murdering Jews in Kristallnacht, right, as the Germans called it. Or we know that you went to the Eastern Front, as the Germans called it, and you watched a mass execution, shooting, murdering of Jews, and then you took a gun and did some yourself. That's not what they had on him. They didn't. What they had on Streicher was literally media activity and media activity only. Isn't that interesting? And that was enough to hang him, rightly so. That trial had all in all 24 defendants. This was the crème de la crème. This is where they tried the leadership, the select few, right? And he was one of them. That's how important they considered him. Again, rightly so. 19 were convicted. I think 12 were sentenced to death. And he was one of those. So think about it. 24 defendants, 12 didn't get the death sentence. They could have said, oh, you know what, Julius Streicher, what you were writing is disgusting, but you were only writing. So we put you in prison for life. No, they said the opposite. What you were writing is disgusting, and it's so bad you will hang with the other guys, the biggest ones, right? And they did it. So that's a very important case. And it actually played a role then later. And at the time, he was formally charged with crimes against humanity because genocide hadn't yet been fully codified. But everybody acknowledges that really this is a proto case for incitement to genocide. That influences the UN Convention 1948 on genocide. And that then has a specific point, Article 3C, that says that the incitement to genocide itself is punishable. Public and direct incitement to genocide is punishable. And under legal experts, one has to understand this is really a crime in and of itself. It is a so-called inchoate crime. So that even if you were to incite a genocide and then no genocide happens, but that has nothing to do with you, right? Maybe somebody stops the government before they can actually implement the mass murder. You still are responsible and you can still be charged. This has never happened in practice. Usually people who get charged with this get charged in the context of a genocide that has actually occurred, but it shows you how important this crime is, right? Doing it alone makes you punishable, right? Whether a genocide even happens or not. Now, the next big case, what takes us to the present, right, where the Genocide Convention itself was used, is a case about the Rwandan genocide of 1994. And that is very clear cut. It was called the media case, right? That wasn't the official name, but everybody called it that because that's exactly what it was. It had 3 defendants, and Two of them had responsible positions in a radio station, RTML, that was also known as Radio Machete for good reasons. And one of them, again, was a newspaper editor, just like Streicher. And all of these three people were sentenced. Now, they weren't sentenced to death, but they were sentenced to long prison terms, not trivial ones, not 2 years, slap on the hand, long prison terms for all of them. That happened in the early 2000s. I think the trial lasted from 2000 to 2003, right? So that's not long ago at all. And it happened under the sort of legal conditions that we also still live under. So we have a clear precedent for charging people with incitement, even if they don't lift a finger or a weapon, right? Incitement as such is enough. Now, here's an interesting problem. The convention says it has to be direct and public, right? So these are sort of conditions, and they restrict the application. But one thing to be said, coded language can still be incitement. So, for instance, when you read about this case about the Rwandan genocide, 1994, you immediately think of what Israeli politicians have been doing. For instance, the Amalek speech, the infamous Amalek speech that Netanyahu gave in October 2023, where he referenced the Bible and the Bible or the Old Testament having essentially a genocidal passage and saying, allegedly God saying, kill everyone, right? And he quoted that and clearly meant to say, well, we do it to them as well. That was barely coded, but you could argue it was coded. Now, the situation right now by precedent is that he could definitely be punished for that. He wouldn't stand a chance saying, oh, I didn't just say kill them all. I said Amalek, Amalek, Amalek. They would definitely still sentence him if the law was applied properly to this bastard, right? The coded language doesn't necessarily protect you. Judges have been clear that the criterion is, did you know that people would understand you? Right? Yeah. And everybody did understand him and he wouldn't get out of that. The other thing, it's very interesting. Legal scholars have been thinking about this a lot and they've come up with detailed descriptions, and I won't do too much of it, but of what would feature in this sort of incitement. And one of the things is what they call accusation in a mirror. That's literally the term. That's when you impute to your victim the crime you are about to commit or committing, right? And this applies perfectly to the Israeli leadership and actually to many in the Israeli media, because they have constantly imputed atrocities that Hamas didn't commit, but the Israelis came very close to committing exactly the same. And they have imputed, more importantly, the intention to commit genocide to the Palestinians and to Hamas, whereas they were about and were committing genocide. It's classical accusation in a mirror. It's perfect, and it's a legal term already, or it's a term of jurisprudence. Prediction, if you use it in the right context, can also qualify. So if you, like Bezalel Smotrich or Gvir, you face the camera and you say, not kill them all. You say, I know they will all be gone. You make a prediction, qualifies, incitement to genocide, and so on and so on. I mean, if you go through these criteria, and there are many, they match Israel perfectly. Now, one thing you also have to fulfill is it's got to be public. But public, you do it radio, TV, social media. I mean, it's easy to prove that. There has never been, we've talked about this before, genocide perpetrators admitting their genocide publicly as these guys have done, right? Amazing. I mean, that's not hard to prove. Here is one wrinkle. What do you do about Western media, for instance, who have simply handed on IDF talking points? What do you do about, say, the German, very important TV broadcaster ZDF, which is essentially an IDF propaganda station? That's all they ever do. They just hand on IDF. So there you could say, look, they're not saying the IDF should murder the Palestinians, right? You could say they're not using prediction, maybe they're not using accusation in a mirror, but there are legal scholars that say, if you can incite to genocide, and we all recognize that this is a possible crime, it's been tried already, then there can also be an aiding and abetting incitement to genocide, which I find extremely interesting. This hasn't been used yet, but imagine in the future, somebody would sue would try to actually launch proceedings against this German broadcaster ZDF and its journalists and editors who were involved in that, and would say, we know that you didn't invent this stuff. We know you handed on the Israeli stuff, but you aided and abetted the genocide the Israelis were committing because you served the propaganda that they used as cover for the genocide. You could very well make such a case. And I personally hope that especially Western media, the BBC as well, will be hit precisely with this sort of case in the future. It hasn't happened yet. We don't have precedent for that, but we really need it.
Well, I have a feeling we're going to have lots of precedent for so many things after,
yes.
There's some accountability with regard to the genocide in Gaza. I wanted to ask you, you wrote this really good piece called The Good, the Bad, and the Privileged, where you're essentially criticizing the centering of so-called good Israelis. So I'm curious if you can talk a bit about that in the sense of what's the problem with elevating these supposed good Israelis into the global conversation, and how does this phenomenon perpetuate colonial dynamics even in these spaces of solidarity?
Yes. Look, I got very angry about an op-ed in the New York Times by an Israeli historian, Omer Bartov. It was a very long op-ed, and Bartov was essentially saying, a Holocaust and genocide scholar, which he very much is. He is a very serious expert. I am telling you this is genocide, right? So on the face of it, you would say, well, that's great. Somebody from Israel, he also has lived in the United States a long time, but he's very much an Israeli by socialization, served in the army as a soldier and as an officer and so on, right? Somebody from Israel comes out and says, this is genocide, right? But there were two levels at which this irritated me immensely, and I really haven't changed my mind on that. I'm still very angry. One is the enormous narcissism of the author. Because if you read the text, it really starts with him. It starts with his pain. He literally uses the word. The pain he had to experience to come to this conclusion. You know what, Omer? If you are an expert in genocide, as you are, you should experience shame, because you had to come to this conclusion much faster than anybody else. You had to be right there. That's what you should experience, shame. I don't want to hear about your pain. So, and then it goes on about, how he was socialized. I don't care. And then there's a long section where he talks about the fact that how Western academia, this is unbelievable, but how Western academia is now facing a problem because genocide studies and Holocaust studies could drift apart. Has this guy heard of what happened to Palestinian academia? Has he heard about what they've done to them? No university is standing, everybody's dead. Does he realize how that sounds? What an extreme egotism. It's blinding. And then in the end, the last section of his thing is about what this means for Israel. It's obvious for him. This is about Israel. And at the end, he actually comes to the conclusion and says, well, if there is a light at the end of this very dark tunnel, a light, it is that Israelis, after this genocide, will perhaps learn a lesson and become, he literally says something like healthier, more rational, and less afraid. And that then they finally will be ready to share the land with the Palestinians.
Unbelievable.
Listen, and he calls it a just reckoning. So imagine the situation. You are Palestinian. The Israelis have stolen your whole land, right? And they're mass murdering you since 1948. In intervals, times it's a little slower, at times it's egregious, like now, right? They're robbing you, they're subjecting you to apartheid. And this good Israeli who thinks he's very good, this liberal Israeli tells you, you know what? A just reckoning, that's the phrase he uses, is you get to share the land with us. No, a just reckoning is that Israel goes away. Israel must go away. And a just reckoning is that the Israelis who have committed specific crimes, and there are a lot of them, must face, ideally, Palestinian courts. That's literally the definition of a just reckoning in this case, right? He can't see it. His readers mostly can't see it. And then this stuff gets celebrated. Like, oh my God, an Israeli speaking the truth, right?
Yeah.
This in itself is an insult to the victims. And I'm tired of it. And we shouldn't give these people that sort of stage. And if they get it, we should challenge them. So let me make one thing clear. I'm not for excluding people literally from the discourse. First, I can't, right? I'm not megalomaniac. But also, I'm not actually for that. But I am for one thing. I am for conditions, tough conditions, real conditions. Yeah. And I think that when a good Zionist, there are no good Zionists, but when a good Israeli approaches you and says, you know what, I'm not on the side of the genocide, I'm different, for which they want points, right? That's also very convenient, right? You should say, in my view, okay, I'm ready to talk to you under several conditions. You condemn Israel. You don't condemn Netanyahu. Don't try. You don't condemn Zionism. That's a given. You condemn Israel as such. You acknowledge that Israel must end. You acknowledge that Palestine must be rebuilt on its whole territory entirely. You acknowledge that Israeli perpetrators must face courts, ideally Palestinian ones. And I would add one, because we have talked about military intervention, and I mean all of this very seriously. I would also add, you must acknowledge that you agree with military intervention against Israel. Don't give me this bullshit where you are, oh, I really don't like that my people are committing a genocide and I'm different. But if somebody were actually to attack them because of that, I don't know what to do. Don't give me that. Don't give me that. You must acknowledge that Israel should cease to exist and that it should be fought by arms to end this horrific injustice.
If you enjoyed this episode and want to hear the rest, you can access it by becoming a Breakthrough News member at patreon.com/breakthroughnews.